I'm pleased to be joined by Frank Kelly to dive into the state of the race and key policy considerations. Frank is a 30-year veteran of Wall Street and DC, founder of Fulcrum Macro Advisors, a political risk advisory firm, and senior political strategist for DWS. Welcome, and thank you for kicking us off today. Thank you. I really want to start by level setting where we are in the presidential campaign. I mean, it has become really harder to trust the polling in the recent years. That said, what can we glean from early data, especially relating to some of the battleground states? Because as we know, the last few elections have really come down to a handful of them.
Well, it is interesting, right, that we're seeing these polls and they seem to be so strongly in favor of President Trump for the moment. I would say this, though, let's remember it's early April. We've got a long way to go. There's a lot of issues out there happening, both domestically and geopolitically. And I think this is so timely to have Admiral Rogers join this as well. So we saw the Wall Street Journal, the poll, which was probably the biggest one most recently released, where former President Trump is leading in 6 out of 7 battleground states. And while everybody's divining this as terrible news for President Biden, it's not good. There's no sugarcoating it. I think we could expect a lot of shifts between now and November. I'd also say this. I do sense, and I actually was just in Iowa yesterday doing some client meetings, and it's very interesting. There's a fatigue out there among voters, right? That they have just been polled and polled and polled, and here it is April, and they just want to. We've just got through a cold winter. I'm not certain people are truly set in stone, so that's one thing to keep in mind. So the accuracy of polls, I think, it's more like Jell-O. It's kind of shaking. It's kind of all over the place. Well, let's wait and see if it firms up. Conversely to that, I'd say the big question is, where do a lot of minority voters go? And I think that's sort of the shock thing that we're seeing out of the polls, African Americans and Latinos seeming to gravitate to President Trump.
Okay. So maybe if we move up to some of the issues that will decide the race, we all know the famous saying from the Clinton campaign, it's the economy, stupid. Right? But this time around, it seems a lot more complicated than that. On one hand, the sentiment around the economy is not matching up with the strength of the data. Issues like immigration are also likely to play maybe a much bigger role. So what do you believe will determine the outcome?
I think there is this sense that the economy is not where it should be among a lot of people, defying what all the data is saying out there, and certainly what the markets are doing. There may be a catch-up effect to this, right? That we get to the middle of summer and people are feeling a little bit better, particularly if Jay Powell and the Fed start lowering rates. But this is a race against time, I would argue, for Democrats, because if this doesn't change, certainly by June or July, I think there's going to be a serious problem for them come November. But I also think there's going to be regional issues here that will play out. Abortion continues to be an issue in polls, and that depends on where you are and what states you're in. Immigration is everywhere in terms of as a hot button issue. As I mentioned, there was an Iowa yesterday. I got more questions about what is going on the border in Fort Dodge, Iowa, than I ever expected. I think that's going to continue to be a big issue. Other big issues will be crime, and I think also the geopolitical issues. Right, you're seeing what's happening in Gaza as a big issue for President Biden right now in polls among his base.
Okay, and we're going to dive into some of the geopolitical issues with Admiral Rogers in a little bit. Frank, of course, you know, the presidency is not the only upcoming election. How do you see the Senate and the House races playing out?
Well, this is what's going to really matter, I think, for the markets ultimately end of the day. At this point, my base case is 60% plus that the House Representatives actually flips to Democrats. You've got such a thin majority for Republicans at this point, and between the issues that they have had to deal with in terms of internal fighting among Republicans and redistricting in a number of states, it's going to be very hard for them to hold on. We'll see. Again, it's April. It's very early. Conversely, you look at the Senate, and I think that probably 60% probability or higher flips to Republicans as a number of Democrats in very red states are up for re-election. It's going to be tough for them to hold on in Ohio, Montana, increasingly Wisconsin. West Virginia is almost certainly going to go Democrat to Republican. So I think that's probably how that's going to play out. And of course, that all means so much for tax issues and other issues in 2025, 2026.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the investments a little bit later, but I guess a divided government probably be better for the markets. If we just maybe fast forward 4 years after the election, what they might look like. Both Biden and Trump have used fiscal stimulus in different but significant ways, but the economy looks a lot different than it did in 2017 or even in 2021. So what is realistic in terms of, Frank, taxes and spending under either candidate?
Well, for both parties, there's going to have to be this come to reality moment here of what are we doing with the deficits. And I think this is going to the first battle line of that. Nobody wants to talk about that in an election year because that gets us into entitlement reform, which is the fastest way to become an unemployed politician. But in 2025 and beyond, we're going to have to talk about Social Security reform, Medicare reform. What are we doing there? As these are rapidly hitting deadlines coming up in the coming years of being bankrupt. So we're going to have to do something about that. And then conversely, the ongoing pressure for industrial policy, right? Reshoring, nearshoring. What are we doing to bring back these critical industries, which are so attractive and are so important to our national economy, but also our state economies in terms of semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, all of that. We've got a real dilemma here, and there's going to have to be some very hard choices made in the next 4 or 5 years. What are we going to do, and how are we going to do them?
Okay. I want to move on to foreign policy because it's obviously front and center. Do you think some of the most extreme proposals, like Trump's, 10% universal tariff, could become a reality if elected?
I think in many ways these could be more threats, if you will, than reality. I think there'll be a lot of pushback from industry on that because of the adverse effect it will have on U.S. exports. It's always possible, though. I think the one thing we know about former President Trump is there is an unpredictable factor to him, and he likes to work with that. So it could be real. I'm dubious that he actually would go the full 10%. So we'll have to wait and see. And that, of course, that's if he gets elected.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. It's very insightful. I hope that you found the discussion as insightful as I did. As always, I encourage you to follow up with your UBS financial advisor to discuss what this all means for your own portfolio. And we will continue to feature a steady stream of insights leading up to the November elections from both our CIO team and external experts, like you heard from today. For the latest, you can always visit ubs.com/ElectionWatch. Thank you.